For period 1, two continuities are presented were the continuing dominance of nations on North America and the Columbian Exchange. The Europeans presented a continuity from previous time periods as they continually dominated North America. They took Indians to work for them and often had fights, although there was not much the natives could do. They took advantage of their strength and immunity to certain diseases such as smallpox to overcome the Indians and take over their lands. The Columbian Exchange also shows a continuity because it demonstrates continuing trades across the world. Now colonists from North America were able to get goods from Europe. An important import into North America was the horse because now people could work their lands better than before. On the other hand, infectious diseases were transmitted by colonists that landed in North America. A change in period 1 that I discussed is a new way of living, especially for the natives. Before colonization, they were free to their lands and had complete control. Now that the colonists have come, they were overtaken by their immense power and had to succumb to their treatment. Life for natives was no longer peaceful.
A continuity in period 2 that can be seen is to continue political dominance and expansion of Americas. Hunting and gathering were a big part of how more and more of America became discovered. This gave the Europeans who came in an advantage to leading to political change and competition between whose land will be whose. The Europeans coming in meaning exchanges between the two countries, such as the Columbian Exchange, which already made a shift in North America's world from feudalism to capitalism. Democratic styles began to rise, leading to self-government. The New England colonies based their power in participatory town meetings where members of the colonial legislature were elected. This leads to political power since the backcountry people were always underrepresented, which were the majority of the people. Another continuity is the treaties and conflicts with the Native Americans. As Europeans are settling into North America and encroach onto Native American lands, Native people still attempt to defend and maintain their political sovereignty. Spanish began to try and extract wealth from the land to develop institutions based on subjugating Native population. American Indian resistance to Spanish colonizing led to the Pueblo Revolt, where the natives rose against Spanish as they tried to force Catholicism into colonies. A change in period 2 is the shift to a more self-government leaning ideal. Colonists' resistance to imperial control drew on evolving ideas of liberty and political thought of the Enlightenment. This includes political power and first British constitution in the colony being the Mayflower Compact of 620 and the Fundamental Constitution of Carolina 1669. John Locke asked to help write the Constitution, meaning self-government also led to more religious tolerance. Another change is the influence of European Enlightenment. Transatlantic commercial and political exchanges led residents of the British colonies to evolve in their political attitudes. This influence of European Enlightenment was brought into the late 17th century, and its purpose was to place observing science and reason all into politics. It took ideas from the scientific revolution to the political sphere and created social contrast theorists. These theorists included John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau to protect the people's natural rights, which are their life, liberty, and property. This causes the people to look more into themselves instead of God and created more of an interest into politics. Continuity that can be seen within time period 3 is the ongoing racism with natives and blacks. After the British victory from the 7 Years' War to fight for economic and political advantage in the Americas generated colonial opposition after imperial officials attempt to prevent colonists from moving westward. Native groups or indigenous people fought back to settle into new lands in Pontiac's Rebellion, which resulted in the Proclamation of 1763, where there cannot be any movement past the Appalachian Mountains. Further in time, when the Constitution is created, it states that it does recognize Indians, but they have no representation in Congress, meaning they do not count in population. As for blacks, slavery is still being continued and relied on, thus created the 3/5 clause in taxes and representation. This means that in the South, they do not count tax on slaves, and in the North, it is the opposite, but every slave counts as 3/5 of a human being. Another continuity is the movement of exploring westward. Many European nations, especially British, migrate to North America to gain the political advantage in any new lands. Frontier cultures had emerged in the colonial period and continued to grow political, social, and power tensions. As settlers would move westward during the 1780s, Congress enacted the Northwest Ordinance for admitting new states. The Congress had the ordinances divided into 14 different states, and it prompted public education, the protection of private property, and a ban on slavery in the Northwest Territory. Many political changes came into the third period, such as the first president that the United States had being George Washington, but a standing out change was brought by the Enlightenment era, which led to the creation of the Declaration of Independence. Enlightenment ideas and philosophy inspired many political thinkers to emphasize individual talent over hereditary privilege. The American Revolution's democratic and republican ideals inspired new experiments with different forms of government. Americans helped gain their independence through leaders through John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Adam Smith, Thomas Paine, etc. Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense, which argues based on experience and reason. It believed in popular sovereignty and was a pamphlet arguing that people should break away from Great Britain. There comes the Declaration of Independence of 1776. It was a social contract stating that all men are created equal and follow the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness saying. After declaring independence, American political leaders created new constitutions and declarations of rights that articulate the role of state and federal governments. While still protecting individual liberties came the creation of the Articles of Confederation, which unified newly independent states, creating a central government with limited power. It conducted warfare, borrowed and issued money, etc. After the Continental Congress, this was the first attempt at having a constitutional framework for the government. The Constitutional Convention proposed a constitution embodying federalism. This brought in representation, politics, and power. It had 2 houses of Congress representation based on population and 1 house with equal representation. Separation of powers and checks and balances came into politics to balance every branch of government and make sure not one is more powerful than the other. These branches included the legislative, executive, and judicial. Debating to ratify the Constitution, anti-federalists opposed the ratification against federalists, so federalists ensured that the ratification by promising the Bill of Rights. It enumerated individual rights and explicitly restricted the powers of the federal government.
For Period 4, 2 continuities are presented with a continuing exclusion of natives by the U.S. and a continued westward expansion into new lands. Under Jackson's new policy of Indian removal, the U.S. continued to exclude American Indians and kept pushing them further west. Many natives did not want to move because they had already been moved before and they were just getting accustomed to the new land. On their march to new lands, their path had been called the Trail of Tears. With the Louisiana Purchase, the U.S. was able to expand westward greatly. With the purchase of this new territory, the U.S. was granted lands west of the Mississippi and nearly double its lands. These new lands were not only important because of the sheer size, but it also allowed the U.S. to access the port of New Orleans, that later allowed them to ship goods through the Mississippi River. For changes, I discussed the rift in the country due to their beliefs on the abolition of slavery. I also discussed the fall of the Federalist Party and the new forming of new political parties because of that. The new beliefs on the abolition of slavery began to split the country in half, the North being pro-abolition and the South being anti-abolition. This rift in ideas was mostly caused by the situation in each part of the country. The South was heavily dependent on slavery and their labor force could not afford to lose their slaves. The North was an economy based on large industrial factories and did not see the point in slavery. These 2 polar opposite ideas were what began to split in the country and ultimately set the stage for the Civil War. After the fall of the Federalist Party, the United States began to form new political parties. The Democrats, led by Andrew Jackson, believed in a weak federal government and opposed tariffs. On the other hand, the Whigs, that included people such as Henry Clay, supported a strong central government and tariffs. These 2 new political powers began to split people into their parties in a way that had never been seen before.
From 1844 to 1877, there were major political changes, including the tension over slavery and migration, which led to the creation of many new factions and led to the division and collapse of major parties, known as the end of the second party system. The second party system consisted of Whigs and Democrats, which, due to these new issues, old issues, but continuing issues, caused the downfall of the Whigs and the creation of the Republicans, as seen in Lincoln's election in 1860. The new parties were very sectional, meaning that the Republicans were exclusive to the North and the Democrats were exclusive to the South after this time period. After the Civil War was fought, which also happened during this time period, the Union victory led to the passage of many critical amendments and laws for the liberation of African Americans. This includes the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and the Freedmen's Bureau, which helped African Americans who had nothing start their new lives. After lenient Reconstruction policy from presidents, including Lincoln and Andrew Johnson, Congress sought to change the balance of power and reorder race relations in the South. Congress thought that the president's Reconstruction plans were just not strong enough, and so they implemented their Radical Reconstruction plan and even went as far as impeaching Andrew Johnson. The Southern Democrats resisted Reconstruction in both society and politics, as Northern Reconstruction policies were cut down significantly over time. So this includes Jim Crow, the KKK, black codes and red shirts, and white leagues, sharecropping and the Cropleyan system, which prevented African Americans from getting any economic success, and the Compromise of 1877, which, in short, ended Reconstruction entirely. So changes during this time period include the politics that shifted from being focused on a states versus federal government issue to one on human rights. So this really didn't happen until the Civil War, until mid-Civil War, with the Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address, which was really a realization that they were fighting for African American rights and they could no longer just contain slavery. They had to abolish it. Another change is the instability of politics due to the social and political issues of the time period led to a change from national parties with varying support to sectional parties. This includes Lincoln being elected as a Republican. You can see in the earlier slide that most, if not all, southern states were Democrat and all northern states were Republican. And this sectionalism didn't really end either. It continued beyond the Civil War and beyond this time period even. Continuities during this time period include that many politicians and social groups continued generating large resistance in order to attempt to keep slavery or a similar alternative. So this continued occurring also, just as the sectionalism did, way after the Civil War and way after this time period. Alexander Stephens was just an example during this time period, and many other politicians who did similar as him to limit African American success and continue exploiting them. Another continuity during this time period was the U.S. expansion westward, which continued being advocated by the government. The Homestead Act of 1862, which gave people free land in exchange for their promise to improve that land, and the Transcontinental Railroad of 1869 were just two examples during this time period, but government advocation towards expansion occurred prior to this with the Louisiana Purchase, Manifest Destiny, and many other examples. The economic inequality of the Gilded Age created several different social and political movements. This includes unions, including the Knights of Labor and AFL, the Farmers Alliance, which eventually led to the Populist Party, and the Socialists and Eugene Debs. All of these groups pushed for more government regulation of the economy because there was really a lot of consolidation and inequality. They pushed for an 8-hour workday for federal jobs, and the Pullman strike and the Homestead strike were examples of inequality from business leaders. The Gospel of Wealth and the Social Gospel were social movements in which the average/above average were expected to aid those in need. So this includes Andrew Carnegie and others, some more religious than him. During this time period, local governments used deceitful tactics to remain in office despite only assisting the wealthy minority. This includes Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall, and they would get votes by using corrupt tactics. The U.S. government advocated the expansion of the economy in their policy, even though they interfered with the Native American way of life and violated treaties signed previously. The Homestead Acts, the railroad land grants, the moral land grants, all extended into Native American territory, which led to the Sioux Wars, in which the Americans won, and the Dawes Act was really a change in Native American policy in which they were to become citizens and ignored as a nation. A change in politics and power during this time period was the new consideration of imperialism in the United States. Alfred Thayer Mahan wanted to improve naval power to prepare for this scenario, and John Fiske and Herbert Spencer, which were pioneers of social Darwinism, really just wanted to justify a reason for imperialism. Another change is the consolidation of markets and economy instability led to the unprecedented social and political movements. The Populist Party and unions, as I previously mentioned, the inequality was at a really high point during this time period, and a lot of people were revolting in order to change that. Poor treatment towards the Native Americans continued during this time period. This improves Custer's last stand, in which General Custer got a lot of publicity due to something cruel that he did in actuality, and the Dawes Act as well. The movements that emerged due to social inequality continued during the Gilded Age. We mentioned this as a change, but also this could be a continuity because of movements such as the women's suffrage movement, which thought that the 15th Amendment, which gave voting rights to African Americans, was not good enough because they were not included in it. During the early 20th century, a new social and political movement sought to resolve issues in the U.S. through greater government action. The muckrackers, Jane Addams, and settlement houses, women's suffrage, the temperance movement, trust busting, and the 17th Amendment were all, and they're even more, part of the progressive movement. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal used government funds in order to aid the nation during a major depression. It also formed a legacy for American liberalism. This includes the first and second New Deal, which include hundreds of changes such as the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Civil Works Administration, and many others which can still be seen in government in action today. The U.S. also became ambitious in the race for territory and became more involved with the rest of the world than ever before. This includes the Roosevelt Corollary, which was a change to the Monroe Doctrine to allow for U.S. involvement in nations that they fear are being controlled or under attack. The dollar diplomacy and the good neighbor policy, which really sought to improve economic relations between American and Latin American countries. And the Spanish-American War and other conflicts showed that the U.S. was really becoming an imperialist nation at the time. One change is that government involvement during this time period reached an unprecedented level that left a legacy on U.S. policies and institutions. The New Deal and the Progressive Movement were both all about proper government involvement, and their policies can still be seen today with Social Security and the FDIC and many others. Another change is that women saw an increased role and made significant social and political movements during this time period. The 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, and Rosie the Riveter, which was a symbol of women in the workforce, really characterized this movement. Continuities during this time period include the U.S.'s continued search for colonies that they became interested in during the late 19th century. This includes the Philippine War, the Roosevelt Corollary, dollar diplomacy, etc. And this could be seen previously with Alfred Thayer Mahan's message. Another continuity is that although African Americans made major contributions for the U.S., fighting in wars, etc., the opinion of many was left unchanged and segregation policies remained. This could be seen in the race riots, which left many African Americans and white people dead, but it was just a method of showing the segregation that occurred in prior time periods as well.